Well, thanks very much, everyone, for joining us this evening. We're so pleased to be able to offer tonight's program. My name is Eliza Canty-Jones, and I'm on staff at the Oregon Historical Society, where our mission is to preserve our state's history and to share it with everyone in ways that advance knowledge and inspire curiosity about all the people, places, and events that have shaped Oregon. We do that work in so many ways through our publications in print and online, our museum, our traveling exhibits, our online exhibits, our research library, which will be opening again soon, so keep your eye out for that. And of course, our public programs like this one. We're all coming from many different places tonight, but I'm here in Southeast Portland, and Portland is located on the traditional homelands of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Watlala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin Kalapuya, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. We often begin our public programs with an acknowledgement of the indigenous peoples on whose homelands we are living and working. And we really want to encourage folks to take the time to learn from those peoples about their history, about the sacrifices that they have been forced to give to make the kind of society in which we're living now, about the ways that those peoples have continued to resist and thrive and maintain their cultures and lifeways and governments and those sovereign nations that are here in Oregon and across the United States. We really encourage taking some time to learn about that. I'm going to introduce tonight's speakers, and then I'll turn it over to them. We encourage folks to enter questions into the Q&A. You can also have conversations in the chat, that's fine. And then we'll pull some of those questions if we have time and introduce those into the conversation. But just to tell you a little bit about this series is called Historians in the News, and it's something that we started about a year ago during the pandemic, the earlier months of the pandemic, when we were really looking at all the ways that historians could bring their lifetimes of research and analysis and work to provide context for the really deluge of news that we're all facing these days. And so we're grateful to be able to continue this program starting this fall. And so keep your eye out for additional Historians in the News programs to be announced from OHS. So our guest tonight is Kathleen Belew, who is a historian, author, and teacher who specializes in the history of the present. She's an assistant professor at the University of Chicago. She spent 10 years researching and writing her first book, Bring the War Home, The White Power Movement and Paramilitary America, which is available for sale through the OHS Museum store, and you can use your store discount. She's spoken about this book in a variety of places, including many media appearances, and her work has featured prominently in documentaries such as Homegrown Hate, The War Among Us, and Documenting Hate, New American Nazis. She's co-editor and contributor to A Field Guide to White Supremacy, which will be on sale on October 26th. She earned her BA in Comparative History Ideas from the University of Washington, where she was named Dean's Medalist in the Humanities, and she earned a doctorate in American Studies from Yale University. She's held postdoctoral fellowships from the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University, Northwestern University, and Rutgers University, and her award-winning teaching centers on the broad themes of history of the present, conservatism, race, gender, violence, identity, and the meaning of war. So she'll be in conversation tonight with our all-the-time host of Historians in the News series, Christopher McKnight Nichols, who is Associate Professor of History and the Sandy and Elva Sanders Eminent Professor of Honors College at Oregon State University, where he is also Director of OSU's Center for the Humanities. He founded and leads OSU's Citizenship and Crisis Initiative, and he is an expert on the history of the United States' relationship with the world, including isolationism, internationalism, globalization, ideas, and political history, with an emphasis on the Gilded Age and Progressive Era through the present. He's an Andrew Carnegie Fellow and Organization of American Historians Distinguished Lecturer, and he's also a frequent commentator on air and in print on US foreign policy and politics, often appearing on OPB's Think Out Loud with Dave Miller. He's an editorial board member of the Made by History section of the Washington Post and a permanent member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He is also the author, co-author, or editor of 6 books, most recently Rethinking American Grand Strategy, which is also for sale at the OHS Museum store, as well as Promise and Peril, America at the Dawn of the global age. Most importantly, Dr. Nichols is a proud member of the Oregon Historical Society's Board of Trustees, and he is a passionate advocate for history and the humanities. Thank you very much, Dr. Nichols and Dr. Belew. I will turn the conversation over to the two of you.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Eliza. It's a pleasure to be with you and to be here supporting the Oregon Historical Society and to have such a spectacular guest to kick off our fall series of Historians in the News. Now relaunching the series, hopefully bigger and better, starting with someone whose work I deeply admire, who's a great scholar, but also a great public intellectual. And that's part of the point of the series, to think a little bit about how professional historians and how professional history can make a difference in the world today, how we can use historical context to better understand our moment and perhaps to chart a better path forward in the future. So I thought that we would just jump right in. Almost 2 years ago now, could it have been, was the last time that we were in conversation at Oregon State University. And I would venture to say that neither of us expected there would be an insurrection on the US Capitol that we would probably anticipate for the rest of our lives as historians teaching that moment and commenting on it. And so I thought we'd just jump right into the deep end here as we get started. We have an audience that's really keen to think about this with us. January 6, 2021, there was a domestic terrorist attack on the US Capitol, something that virtually everybody didn't expect or seemingly didn't expect. What do you make of that in historical perspective and today?
Yeah, you know, it's an interesting thing to watch. You know, I began Bring the War Home at a time when everyone thought this was a fringe project that would not have any bearing on our political mainstream. It was a bunch of disaffected radicals on the edges. It wasn't something that most people thought of as part of our political conversation at all. And it happened to be in copy edit, which is, for those who have not been through this, the very last chance to make changes to the book as the Unite the Right rally unfolded in Charlottesville. And this set of issues came sort of careening back into our political mainstream. And since that moment in 2017, this has just gotten bigger and bigger. This groundswell has grown. It's taken up more and more of our level of public concern. There's a number of measures we might look at there. And I think the most critical one is that the DHS and the FBI have now designated domestic terrorism from homegrown extremists and particularly white power movement extremists as the greatest terrorist threat to the nation. That all brings us to January 6th. All of that happened before January 6th. So there's one set of events that, as someone who's tuned to this, I've been watching unfold, and you know, there's no amount of not being surprised that takes away the shock of seeing those events on January 6th. The other thing to think about is that January 6th really follows the map set by the Turner Diaries, which is a dystopian novel that lays out a set of strategies and actions that this movement has used since the book was published in the 1970s. The Turner Diaries has an incredibly violent prognosis for how to achieve not only a white homeland, but also through genocide, an all-white planet. It is the most extreme distillation of the white power worldview that I've encountered anywhere. And one of the events in that book is an assault on the US Capitol that is not meant as a mass attack, which stands in stark contrast to most mass violence in the book, but instead is imagined as a selective strike show of force that's supposed to awaken other people to radicalization. That's what January 6th was. It's absolutely in step with the rest of this organizing. And what it tells us, first and foremost, is that that is not the crescendo or the end point. That is the beginning of a set of actions that, if not stopped, will have mass violence on the list of things to come.
Yeah, wow. Well, that's sort of dystopian way to start, and appropriately dystopian, it seems like. Maybe taking a slight step to the side, it would be useful for us to talk a little bit about what's going on with the January 6th Commission in relation to this. Do you think that members of Congress are understanding this deeper context? I mean, obviously, we would like them as professional historians to get it more and more deeply. Are they getting it? Will they be getting it more? What stands out to you as most important as what's going on now? And I'll just toss one piece out there for viewers and listeners. Right, in the last week or so, congressional Republicans with kind of increasing audacity have been saying they're vowing repercussions for tech companies producing any information about members of Congress themselves and that what they were saying during those moments, right? And we've seen all kinds of reports about those calls, and they've gone so far as to actually threaten tech companies, saying Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy has said something like, a Republican majority in the future will not forget if you actually give what these subpoenas are asking for. So that's one small data point of the kinds of politics that are roiling about trying to get to the bottom of what happened as a selective strike, as a first stage, or as a new dawning or reckoning of a kind of movement. So, what are you seeing out there that's happening in terms of the investigations themselves and maybe the deeper context?
So one of the things that's been going around that I would just add to that set of data points is this Reuters report that where a reporter spoke to, it sounds like a small number of people, and it was not clear at what level of the FBI, that sort of laid out the possibility that it could be an inside job. I've now seen things going around that is discredited. I think that the long and short of all of this is that a full picture of an event like this is, as any historian will tell you, is hardly ever possible to get in real time. What we have is a scattering of stories. We have the statements of people about what they were doing, which, as we know, are not always the truth about what they were doing. We have contextual information about what they did before and after January 6th. And we have ideological information about what these actions mean and what they sought out to accomplish. The ideological information about the people on that day that were white power activists, and here I'm talking about only perhaps one set of 3 strands of people. So let me pause there and explain what I mean. I think January 6th is best understood as the collision of 3 different forces. All of them are sort of ultra right wing, but they're not all violent. So I think what we have is the collision of QAnon, which is a largely new and very radical, very rapid sort of online conspiracy movement, with the Trump base, which is usually not overtly violent in the way that white power activists are, with organized white power activism. And here I'm talking about things like Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, 3%ers, militia groups. All of those groups are part of the same groundswell. We usually treat them as separate. They are not separate. And those groups come with a national network, decades-long national network of paramilitary camps and training, the seizure of weapons from military posts and bases, the circulation of ideological content, social relationships that show how these groups are interconnected. We have the receipts on that stuff going back to the late 1970s when this movement came together. So that is different than something like, oh, this is just a reaction to Trump's oratory, or, oh, this is just about QAnon and web-based misinformation. Those are factors here, but the thing that concerns me as someone who studied this movement is that the infrastructure, the people, the social networking, and the history are coming from that other place. And there we have a lot that we know because we have, decades worth of archives that tell us that this movement is interested in overthrowing the government, that they think about themselves as the white race, that's their nation, not the United States. So when we think about white nationalism, we're not talking about the United States as the nation at play here. We're talking about the Aryan nation. And we know that they are living in a sense of state of emergency and apocalyptic fear about being, out-reproduced, about the transition of the nation to a nation of non-white majority, and that they think they have to take violent action to stop that from happening. So it doesn't take a lot to go from that history to reading the tea leaves about why these activists would feel that this is the time to act. Trump called out to them in the debate when he talked about Proud Boys, stand back and stand by. I get it all confused. It's been a minute since we talked about that one because there have been so many of these events.
So many.
So they've had a direct call out. They had January 6th. And now we have the census information coming out that says that exactly what they're worried about is happening, that the white percentages of many American communities are declining, that immigration is up, that multiracial families are up. They don't see that as soft demographic transformation. They see that as the end of the white race. That's racial annihilation and apocalypse. So this is a moment that's very, very volatile already. And then we add to that the aftermath of the war in Afghanistan and the end of this very long and protracted global war on terror. And it's a recipe that I think, people have been ringing the bell about this for so long. And I don't know how we keep inflecting and inflecting and inflecting without getting to a mass casualty event, but I'm very concerned about how much farther we can go until we get to that place.
Yeah, as am I, frankly. And your work really indicates why we should have that fear. It's a reasonable fear. It's not overthinking or catastrophizing. It is on the horizon, and it may almost be inevitable, which is another piece of our thinking about what's happening in Congress and a number of other dimensions here. I wanted to ask a sort of side point of what you just were referencing. So if you think about some white power activists in their protests, if you think about some of the rhetoric that you get out of at least the most politically savvy folks, one of the things you often hear is there's nothing wrong with white nationalism, or that, three percenters and other folks argue that they're very much in keeping with a kind of tradition, American revolutionary tradition. They invoke iconic founding fathers. They wave the flag and they use other kind of symbols of civil religion to try to cloak themselves in a kind of legitimacy. And I wondered how I know in your work you do this, but maybe for our audience, you could help us unpack some of those symbols and tropes and actually show how they're really referring to something other than that which they nominally seem to suggest.
Yeah. So I think the best place to sort of get into that is the militias, because in the early 1990s, when this first surged, and then again in the present moment, there is a discourse about the militias that they are not racist, that many of them are not overtly racist, that they are just patriots, right? That they are pro Second Amendment, that they are interested in a defense against federal tyranny, and that they are interested in sort of like maintaining American values. And I think the reason that this is so effective is that it taps into a unresolved tension in the American polity. And this, with my students, this is where we use Hamilton to sort of pick this apart. And I'm happy to do that in Q&A. If you would like me to do the Hamilton analogy, I can do it. But basically the question is it the job of the federal government to restrain the inherent violence of the mob or the people? Or is it the job of the people to restrain the inherent violence of the federal government? And this has been a tension from the beginning. Jefferson and Hamilton argued about this. We have, lynch mobs are usually throughout American history talking about restraining the state or taking the law for themselves. This is like, where is sovereignty located? Is it in the people or is it in the government? And that tension is real. That is experienced by people in all kinds of ways that are nonviolent. Questions about local versus distant control, questions about states' rights, although this is of course racially inflected in ways we can talk about. I think it is a live wire that is not resolved fully in our laws and in our politics. And so it's something that can be co-opted by this movement. But if we want to be real about this, what they're saying is that they want to preserve the nation as it was. And by that, they mean for white people, right? Usually for white property owning men. And they want to preserve the parts of the government that they wish to preserve. So for instance, if you think about something like many militias are affiliated with posse comitatus, which is an idea that you'll obey the law, but only from the local sheriff down. You're not going to obey anybody higher than that authority. We saw this come back up in Michigan around the Gretchen Whitmer kidnapping attempt. We've seen this come back up a couple of other times. And there what we have is this distillation of something that sounds like states' rights, but is actually profoundly violent. You're saying that you won't heed the authority of something like, an arrest warrant that comes from the FBI. You won't heed the authority of federal land. This is why land management officers often get killed in places like Oregon. So the militias are one example. All of this is because at the bottom, all of this is working from a playbook of opportunism that's been used by these groups for more than 100 years, where they go into whatever the local community issues are and use them for their own purposes. So if you think about the Klan in the 1920s, which is the really big one, 4 million people, 10% of the state of Indiana, it's huge. And they are, you know, in your high school history textbook, my guess is that you learned that that Klan was about anti-Black action and possibly about anti-Semitism. And that's true. But that Klan was also anti-labor in places like Oregon, where there were strong labor unions. It was anti-Mexican in Texas, where there was concern about immigration and the border. It was anti-immigrant in the Northeast, where there were a bunch of immigrants coming in. And so it's able to sort of use local scapegoats to mobilize for its own purposes for recruitment and radicalization. So the way to think about this is that white power is always looking for the open window. And when there is a point of social tension, it will use it, but always for the same purpose.
Yeah, that was great. That was a great answer, because you got to the political thought, this strategic kind of component about opportunism, that it taps into something that's more broadly appealing different regions and through different kinds of mindsets, including something that some not particularly sympathetic folks might wind up being, how they might be co-opted in some ways, right? Through those sort of, and so I wonder then, that also gets us to how state structures deal with that, right? So one thing that's happening right now is Congress. Then there's state, you can think about federal prosecutions, you can think about state level prosecutions, Oregon and the occupation of Harney County, right? The Malheur Reservation. Then why those things don't work out so well. One of the things you say, you really was news to me, and I highly recommend in your book, Bring the War Home, but broader literature also suggests is a very effective way that they thwart prosecution or thwart accountability. Could you talk a little bit more about that, and maybe even perhaps if you're willing, start with the congressional level? What can we expect? What's going on with the prosecutions? And then maybe dive down to other ways in which states try to deal with this in their own, sometimes ad hoc and deeply problematic ways.
Yeah, so the big thing here is that what we usually get are a bunch of individual level prosecutions. We also get this in our stories about the white power movement, because usually what you read about is a tiny percentage of what's happening. So you can have a very dedicated reporter go out and write about, say, the Proud Boys, and you might be up on the news about the Proud Boys. You might even have dutifully signed up for like a Google News alert, and you get every story about Proud Boys, right? But that is a fragment of what we're talking about, because what we need to be doing is connecting that with the base and Atomwaffen and Boogaloo and Three Percenters and Oath Keepers and a bunch of stuff that we're not even aware of as it's happening because it's underground. So that all happens that way because of a strategy that this movement adopted in the early 1980s called leaderless resistance. And this is effectively cell-style terrorism. The idea is that one or a few people will work in small groups or individually towards a common set of objectives, but without ties to each other that can be prosecuted and without direct communication with movement leadership. So this was implemented for two big reasons. One was that a lot of FBI informants had infiltrated the Klan during the civil rights movement, and that was expensive and caused a lot of problems. The other is that it makes it much harder to have a court prosecution when everyone seems to be acting alone. And the few times we've tried it, it has gone very, very badly. And I'm happy to talk about that more. That's one of the big hurdles with January 6th. What you get instead, though, as the biggest consequence of leaderless resistance is that we lose the entire movement from public focus. There is no sense that this is all coordinated, that these people share social relationships. Instead, we get stories about a lone wolf, which is not possible within the white power movement. There are individual actors, but they are ideologically connected. They are not lone wolf actors. And I'm happy to explain that further. There is, of course, individual violence. There are, for instance, mass shootings that are not political in this way, but within the white power movement, lone wolf is a misnomer. We also sometimes get stories about a few madmen or bad apples, and usually things like the Oklahoma City bombing are remembered this way, when instead there is a huge, capacious record of McVeigh having deep ideological and social connections with white power before carrying out that bombing in 1995. So, okay, so leaderless resistance in terms of January 6th looks like this. So the burden to proving seditious conspiracy is very, very high. We tried it at a federal trial of 13 activists within the white power movement in 1987-88 in Fort Smith, Arkansas. And we needed to prove that these people had conspired to overthrow the government. Now, from the historical archive, it is clear without a doubt that that's what they were doing. They said that's what they were doing. They were outfitted with all kinds of weapons and paramilitary camps. They had demonstrable ties with each other. They had, and I should say, weapons means what you would expect in terms of things like M16s and AR-15s, but they also had anti-tank weapons, surface-to-air missiles, and a bunch of other more concerning armament. Homemade landmines, which I think being homemade is already concerning, but having them is also bad. So that trial didn't work because the burden of proof is so high, and because our legal system has all kinds of remnants of other kinds of bias that make it very difficult to convict. So in that case, for instance, 2 jurors had romantic relationships with defendants during the trial. I think we can all agree that this is not an impartial jury. A lot of evidence was excluded because of chain of custody problems and handling it and having to do with FBI versus local police jurisdiction. And then there were also issues to do with jury selection. So one of the jurors reported believing that the Bible prohibited interracial relationships, which, by the way, was common in Arkansas where this was tried in the 1980s. That's not an unusual belief, but it is a concerning belief for an impartial jury here. And then there were also some issues with things like excluding all of the jurors who had ever heard of white power groups in the region. So that's, in this region, anyone who had read the newspaper or watched a TV news show in the last several years. So we have a lot of things like that built into our processes. So if we want to have a January 6th commission that can really deal with this, they need not only phone records, they need all kinds of subpoena power. They need huge amounts of sunlight into what these activists were doing before January 6th, what kinds of things they were involved in, what kinds of ideas they had, what kinds of people they were in contact with, because the way that you track this is through social relationships, ideology, and prior activity.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I really appreciate your giving the example of 87, 88 too, which kind of clinches one of the things we've seen, in the ensuing several, a number of decades, and possibly that portends some things about how some of these trials will go moving forward. I want just changing gears slightly. Thanks everybody for putting things in the chat. We will get to some of your questions. Liza Canty-Jones will be back at the end to bring a few in and synthesize them. So I'll be trying to bring a few of those in, but we've got a ton ready to go here. One of the things I wanted to talk a little bit about is policymaking. It's rare for us historians to have any policy impacts, even those of us working on the very recent past. And you had an opportunity to present and testify before Congress. It kind of became a big, or it's seemingly big in my orbit, in your orbit for sure, moment. And I wondered, what it felt like to testify as part of a series that's trying to get to the bottom of confronting violent white supremacy, something that your scholarship exposes so clearly, and it's a motivation for you, obviously, to try to bring this out there, and then also having it become a high-profile moment, undoubtedly in a way you didn't expect. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I think you're referring to a panel where I was on with a pundit who was not at all interested in engaging the question. And, it's unfortunate, but I think, well, I'll just say, I go to venues like that as a historian to do what I see as my civic duty and my scholarly duty to report on the findings of my research. I think that is where my authority lies, and I'm not trying to be a pundit. So sometimes things get swung in the other direction by the rest of the panel. I will say this, I think that all of these are learning experiences, and there are a lot of places where history can influence policy. Only one of those is the highly performative and often contentious floor of Congress, right? Which is its own sort of theater and has its own sort of rules that I am only just now even dipping a toe into. I think what's been more inspiring for me actually has been speaking with people who work behind the scenes, who are putting together the policy reports, the briefings on what might happen next, people who work at security agencies who are really trying their level best to figure out how to address this problem without sort of contributing to other kinds of systemic inequality, people who are really doing the journeyman's work of trying to confront the issue. And that's where I find my time to be more valuably spent. That said, I think that, there's plenty of room for talking about all of these issues with anyone who is serious about facts and information, and I'm happy to do that work always.
And that's a great even-handed professional historian's answer, which I respect. A lot of us try to intervene in the public square, leveraging our expertise. A lot of the folks I most admire. It doesn't mean we don't have our own views, and they certainly inflect what we do. And this is something that professional historians, in this series, we talk a lot about. Look, historians have biases as well, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a problem. All history is revisionist, for instance, but we are people of the archives. We're people of the facts. We show our work. You said earlier, we have our receipts, right? You can prove what you said. I know reasonable people may disagree with interpretation, but they really shouldn't, ignore those facts. That's something we're all kind of
what I think is a super good example is, so my next book has to do with gun violence and mass shootings. And one of the things that I've been talking with people about is that at the policy level, part of what it is a prioritization of problems. So if we're talking about like, what are the problems facing our country? White power is only one of many other things that we need to be talking about and thinking about it. It's my topic. And so I'm there to talk about that. But I'm not the person who decides what the topic of the day should be. And I'm not the person who decides the relative importance. And I think that's probably for the best, because especially when I started talking about this work, I've been down here in this cave thinking about this one thing. And there's all kinds of other push and pull factors going on. And many of them are frankly classified, and I might not know everything. But then we have to make some decisions about things like this. So one of the things that's come up recently is, why talk about mass shootings at all? Because if we want to think about gun violence, mass shootings are a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the problem. We should be talking about intimate partner gun violence. We should be talking about guns in cities. We should be talking about all of the times that guns are fired accidentally and kill people. And those numbers are much bigger, right, than something like a mass shooting. And there I have to be a historian in a different way and say, we also have to figure out how to tell a story about mass shootings, because we have these events that are experienced as cataclysms in communities that are shaping the way our children go to school, that are shaping the way we imagine safety and danger, that are shaping our education, that are shaping, one example I like to give a lot is that for a long time, the hardest thing to teach about mid-20th century America for me was how seriously people took fear of the bomb. This is something that for a little while, students, I couldn't quite get them, because from here it looks a little bit crazy, right? Like if you watch Bert the Turtle Duck and Cover Drill videos, and please go Google this after this tonight, because it's quite a lot of fun. But they're saying, crouch down if you see the flash and put a newspaper over your head. And my students are laughing, because that's just, it's appalling to think that could help at all. And yes, I know it could help with flash burn or whatever, but the point is, you're not safe because you've done this. So for a little while, we couldn't bridge this gap between the comical sort of hindsight view of Bert the Turtle and the embodied fear of the bomb that people had at mid-century, and how it shaped all kinds of parts of American life. And then one year, like a light switch, they all got it immediately. And I've been pulling like a loose thread on the sweater, like, why is that? Why is it that this clicked into place? It's because they all do active shooter drills, and they understand the idea that there's this thing that you're supposed to do drills that probably won't help, that you have to somehow keep safe from. We've accepted this danger as part of our life. We're not taking action at the political level to dismiss the danger. We expect you, our kids, to run in a zigzag and to run, hide, fight, and to do these other things. So it's really interesting how the historian's job, I think, there is to figure out the narrative truth and not the statistical prioritization. I think that's where we can help with the policymakers figuring out how to connect some things that otherwise wouldn't be in the same picture.
Yeah, that's a great example of the utility of history, the understandings of different social moments, and the kind of in some ways amorphous cultural factors that contribute to how we think about a given moment or operate in it, and the blinders that we have in the present. Another example I've just been thinking about is in the 1918 flu pandemic. Kids were kept out of school. Kids had to have classes outside. Colleges had lecture halls outside. People wore masks. You hear folks talking today as if it's, you know, absolutely anathema that children would wear masks. And yet they regularly wore masks. And then you look at, and then you say, okay, well, what do kids today think? And you can look at survey research and you say, oh, wow, they actually much more strongly resent having to wait in line and be quiet than wear masks. And if you go back in time, you can see there's Gallup surveys that suggest that kids really hated duck and cover drills, not because they thought they were positive or negative. They were a waste. They often went before different moments like recess and things that they actually wanted to do. So, you know, again, we historians can remind folks that we maybe don't live in such a novel era, and that there are some other kind of contextual factors that should condition how we think of a given moment.
Yeah, and I find a lot of hope in that, the times that people have survived these very difficult, awful things and, you know, gone on to keep living. There was a piece on the radio about the 1918 flu, because in Chicago, if you've ever been in Chicago, every building is like 97 degrees during the window, and there's huge steam heater radiators that thump and hammer by every window. And it's because during the flu, you're supposed to keep the window open to let the air circulate, just like we are now, right? So all of a sudden, here we are prepared to open all of our windows. It's not really great for climate change, but it's pretty good for COVID. I mean, it's an interesting sort of full circle moment.
Yeah, and Chicago and New York, major school districts stayed open and tried to use those techniques in 1918, right? And although it's actually, if you track down through the historical literature, the similar thing was said about New York City apartments, that they had those radiators because of the flu, but actually they predate the 1918 flu pandemic.
So, scandal.
Yeah. So I don't know about the Chicago case, but at least in the New York case, folks want to make that connection. They're actually missing it slightly.
Well, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
I have to find out.
Definitely. Well, I have the resources. The guy who keeps writing about 1918 flu. So one other way of thinking about what we're just talking about is about media coverage. And when I was talking to the professional staff at the OHS about this event, we were talking a little bit about, you know, you've had the opportunity to do CNN commentary, MSNBC. I've done some of that myself. You know, what do you think about media coverage of a number of these issues we're talking about? Historical context for current events more broadly, just in general, and then also maybe more specifically about some of the areas you know so terribly and wonderfully well.
I'm so happy to have that question because it lets me talk about this new field guide that we've just gotten together, and it's going to be a book. It's going to be a physical object. I'm so excited. So, one of the things that I noticed doing all of this press for Bring the War Home and for the events that followed is that journalists, even when they are very well-meaning, are often sort of parachuted into one of these stories with absolutely no context and no help. And it's not their fault. There's a whole lot of reasons for why that is. But if you look in the Associated Press style book, which is still the sort of governing source of information for many newsrooms, there's a ton of information on ISIS and Al-Qaeda. There's even stuff in there on the Irish Republican Army, which is a huge story for quite a bit of time. There is hardly anything on the white power movement. And most of what's in there is not correct. And then as I got into this and shared my concerns about this with other scholars who work on racial violence, similar problems are in this style book about things like immigration, about queer studies, about the way that people use different kinds of racial descriptors. So that book is really meant as a resource for journalists and activists who want to understand sort of the lay of the land from scholars. It's meant to be a quick and hopefully very well indexed, usable reference so that you can locate kind of the most up-to-date scholarly consensus about some of these issues, and also who you might ask if you have questions. Because as you may have noticed, the expert space on cable TV has a whole lot of people in it, and a lot of them are very wonderful and well credentials, and a lot of them are people who were available that day at the last minute, because this is how it works, right? It's it's a business like anything else. And there's a lot of constraints, and I can absolutely understand that. But part of what I've learned is that a lot of the work of the historian is in the pre-interview with the executive producer or the third assistant in my case, where they ask you, like, what should I be asking about this? Like, what should we be talking about? What are the questions? And that is like, I didn't even know that that was part of the process in producing a cable news show when I started this. I'd done no TV at all. And it's been really interesting to kind of figure out where there's space to not only answer a question, but to shape what question is asked, because that's where I think historians can really use our training to expand the public conversation.
That's perfect. It's like we're on the same wavelength totally, because I want to ask a very specific question that may help our audience too, and is the kind of thing that it'll be in the field guide, and it should be in the AP style guide, and should be in a number of these other venues, which is something that comes up in my classes and we've talked about before, which is, when you hear about the white power movement, often in public reporting, very often in the recent past, including when there are incidents of violence, including January 6th, it's often cast in positive or negative terms that are somewhat vague. And we hear things like white nationalism, which we've talked a little bit about, or, considering President Trump's statements and several other people in the administration saying there's nothing wrong with white nationalism, white nationalism, only the lone wolves and the bad eggs, those are the bad versions of this.
Right.
And then you sometimes also hear, or again, often on the political right, from pundits and provocateurs, but other folks, about white supremacy. And okay, that's a different thing. Or you hear it from the left rejecting all white nationalism. So very basic, but really tough question in some ways. What's the difference between them, and what difference does it make if we can distinguish, those of us citizens, people who care about this, between white nationalism and white supremacy?
Yeah, and I thank you for the question. This is in the field guide. I hope it will be useful as a reference, maybe in teaching, maybe for your own use, to those in the audience. But so I think it helps to just lay out some definitions. So white supremacy, as understood by historians, is a big, complicated melange of things. It includes individual racism, but it includes a whole bunch of other things besides individual racism. It includes all of the systems and histories that create persistent racial inequality, even when nobody involved is individually racist. So we might look at things like maternal mortality rates, or the wealth gap, or different rates of hospitalization with COVID, or incarceration. In all of these places, we see persistent racial inequality. And it's not always because everyone in the room is racist. In fact, this happens even when no one in the room is racist, because we are dealing with a system of laws and histories that have come down to us through overt racism. It is not that long ago that we had legalized racism on the books and de facto racism throughout our entire country. Not that long ago. So all of that is white supremacy. Within that is a smaller category of people who are individually racist, who believe in white supremacy, who believe that white people are chosen or special or better or any of that. Within that, there is a smaller number of people that believe in white nationalism. And I think white nationalism might be productively broken into two camps. One is a group of people who believe that there is something inherently white about the United States that must be maintained, right? So this can appear as Western chauvinism, Western civilization, Euro, what's that one? Euro something something, I forget. There's a new one, Euro something something. And people who want to legislate whiteness in some way. And then there is white nationalism that is in fact white power, which is, we are a white nation. Our nation is not the United States, but the Aryan nation that includes all white people the world over. And it is our job to protect that nation from its enemies, which is all non-white and Jewish people the world over. That is the white power movement. Now, within that second strand of white nationalism, white power ideology, most of it is dedicated to violence. A small bit of it is non-violent. It has to do more with separatism and survivalism, but they are shoulder to shoulder with people who are at war on the country because they are interested in preserving or creating a white homeland. So big category of white supremacy. Within that is individual racism. Within that is white nationalism. Within that is the white power movement and overt violence of the white power movement. So we're talking about a tiny strand of white supremacy. And so one example of that prioritization work that I was talking about before is if we want to confront white supremacy, white power is just one part, or in this book, white power is one chapter. There's a whole bunch of other things we have to talk about, like immigration policy and the persistence of Black poverty and violence against trans persons in our nation and gender violence. And there's a whole bunch of stuff involved. So this book is a way of bringing together people who study all of those things and trying to put it all in one volume.
So a couple questions have come in that kind of have a bearing on this. Then I want to move to some other stuff. But here's Eliza, so maybe she has a thought on some of the questions related to this.
You go ahead and ask a question related to this, and then I'll bump to some of the others.
Okay, yeah. Well,
Yeah.
So one is about the ideas that make up these movements and the distinctions that you're drawing. And someone said, obviously they're not inevitable. So what makes you think, or what are the ways in which these arising in the US, questions of racial purity, violence, white nationalism, in some of the forms that you're just talking about, white power movements in particular that are violent or vigilantes. Is there something about the US case that's significant or important historically and helps inform the present? Or is this more, an international phenomenon that we should understand? How do you see that set of connections and the ideas and the movements arising in the US over time?
Yes, so the answer to that is both. The US is particular and is the genesis point for a lot of the white power ideology that is shaping the transnational movement today, but it is a deeply transnational movement and has been pretty much from the jump, and at least has been in earnest since the late 1990s. We can think about World Church of the Creator set up chapters all over the place. Aryan nations mailed their stuff to different countries. If you were in Australia, as the Christchurch gunman was, you could order this kind of material from mail order catalogs before you could get it online. And then, of course, the internet has just flash expedited all of that and made this into one small world where people can reach each other quite quickly. So it is transnational, but it's also uniquely American. And here I would point to one of the big lessons of Bring the War Home for me, which is that the best predictor of white power activity or Klan activity in US history is not poverty or gains in racial equity or immigration or populism. It is the aftermath of warfare, full stop. There is a surge that matches the aftermath of every major war in American history, at least since the Civil War when the Klan kind of came onto the scene. And I think we can make this argument about vigilantism earlier too, but it's not really my specialty, so I will leave that to others to make. I think that one of the things we have to think about right now is what happens to that spike when we're dealing with something like the global war on terror, when we have this incredibly protracted 20-year war. My students don't remember a time when we weren't at war before this last few weeks of news about Afghanistan. They don't remember 9/11. I had a student named for the millennium recently. Like they're of this war. And one of the things we have to think about is if we push warfare down to a very small fragment of our society, we mostly segregate the communities that fight those wars for us. We don't see pictures of coffins coming home unless there's a huge thing like the withdrawal from Afghanistan, even though we've had fatalities this whole time. What that does to the spike in white power violence, I don't know. Are we looking at sort of a delay and then a big spike? Are we looking at a surge that will be slow growing but prolonged? I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. But we know that there will be a surge. We're already seeing something. And I think that that's one of the things that's very, very concerning from a historical standpoint.
Thank you. There's a few questions in the chat that have to do with the power of the state in responding to this, and even some concerns about, one question about concerns about state overreach in responding, having identified this huge threat. Another question looking at how could the Patriot Act be used to more effectively identify some of these groups as terrorist organizations? And then with both of those in mind, there's a question about the non-right-wing activism. So the anti-fascist activists who would describe themselves as pushing back against these white power activists and the danger that they bring to communities, and how the state should be responding to that. So can you speak to all of that some?
Absolutely. So first of all, I think that those things should not be compared the way that they typically are. I think if you put the body counts of what we would broadly describe as anti-fascist activism next to the body counts of the white power movement, there's just no contest. I think the death toll from anti-fascism is something like 3 since the early 1990s. And we're talking about, hundreds of known fatalities, including the largest domestic act of terrorism at the Oklahoma City bombing, other than 9/11. On the other side, I think the white power movement is organized and intent on destruction of the state, intent on anti-democratic action, and intent on harm against civilians. And from everything we know so far, Antifa is not any of those things. So I think there is simply no comparison there. I think when we think about state overreach, this is a really important set of questions. And this is one reason that most people in the, well, I guess I can't really fairly say that. Many people in the watchdog space are strongly interested in trying to use only existing legal instruments to confront this, because the history shows us very clearly that when we create new laws, they don't usually go towards white power confrontation. They usually end up affecting communities of color who are already over-policed and over-incarcerated. And that's, within a framework where we present our only option as incarceration when we think about what we might do about something like this, which I think historians are also pushing back very strongly against as the only possible way of doing it. I think that one thing we can do is expand our imagination about all of these things. But I will say this, there is a real divide, I think, about whether we should. So, okay, so I have to confess to you, my hesitation is because I'm torn. I've talked to a lot of people about this. I'm not a policymaker, and I find compelling arguments on both sides. On one side, I think it is wrong, as one FBI person put it, to think about a bombing by Atomwaffen being prosecuted and punished differently than a bombing by ISIS. They are both terrorism. They both punish people. They both impact a whole bunch of people beyond the action, and they're both criminal acts. So calling them terrorism is important to a lot of people for that reason. And it also means a lot to impacted communities to be able to say that was terrorism. That was not just an individual action, that was terrorism against our community. And one of the ways that really came home to me was simply seeing the reactions on Facebook and Twitter to January 6th. A whole bunch of people were posting things like, why does this feel so bad? And the answer is because we were witnessing an act of domestic terrorism. That wasn't a protest or a tourist visit. We were witnessing an act of terrorism. Okay, the other side is the sort of long view historical argument that creating additional instruments, expanding the Patriot Act, expanding something like a prosecution of ideology has in the past far disproportionately impacted marginalized communities, more than it has done anything to constrain what we might think of as the violence of the majority. So I don't know, guys, this is where I get pulled apart. I think that those are both really compelling pieces of information. And what I want is some middle route between those two things.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. And I would add in the even longer history to suggest, if you want to go with body counts or spectacular violence, if you look at white power movements broadly defined over more than 100 years, it's a far more disparate comparison there. If you look at left-wing activism in the US, even in the level of violence and coercion, it was a very much often in the late 19th century, which I know very well, about rhetorics of violence to try to galvanize labor forces to work together to make change, not about actual spectacles of violence. So you had a lot of talk about using dynamite and not a lot of actual use of dynamite. But what you did have, and what the question is exactly right about, is you had a lot of police overreach because there was language related to this.
Exactly.
Haymarket, is a best example in 1886, a great example of this, where police overreach winds up being the way in which you get a whole lot of people who probably weren't guilty hung. So anyway, just underscoring.
Well, no, and I think this goes through to the late 20th century too. And we can think about, for instance, COINTELPRO, which is the FBI interrupt and disrupt sort of program that they used against extremist groups. COINTELPRO impacted people on the left and the right, but it far impacted people on the left more than people on the right. It was much more effective. It was much more violent. There were more resources. There was more manpower. There was never, an assassination of a Klan leader like the assassination of Fred Hampton. There was never anything comparable. So what we get is real impact with paramilitary groups on the left in that period. And we get intact resources and social networks on the right. And that's part of what allows the emergence of white power to begin with in the late 1970s. So I think this is all part of the same set of issues. So similarly, I think we have to distinguish really carefully between the systemic problems in FBI policy and individual people within that organization who are really trying to use those resources to confront this issue. So this is true in the earlier archive too. I always use this example of this guy, Jack Knox, who was a ground level FBI agent who was right on the edge of getting them so many different times. He was using every possible, legal avenue to try to run things up the chain to get authority, to get in. I think, honestly, he might have prevented Oklahoma City if he had made one bust where they decided not to go into one compound. I mean, it's just, so there are journeymen who are there trying within these imperfect systems too, trying to do their best. And I've gotten to meet some of those folks now, and I think it would also be a mistake to just uniformly say like the FBI is bad, the FBI is tainted, because I think that there are people within these organizations that really are trying to do their best here too. So anyhow, yeah. So again, I guess I'm a middle of the road person.
I think that understanding that big entities like federal agencies are actually just people is one of the benefits of studying history, because you sort of have to break down the complexity of it. There's some questions that we want to ask that have to do with the particularity of Oregon. So somebody's asking about the cultural conditions of a place like Oregon, manifest destiny, rugged individualism, the myth of the frontier. And then there's also someone looking at the small farming homestead movements and white power movements in Oregon. And you touched on that a little bit about some folks that are sort of almost sometimes literally right up next to each other, but maybe not ideologically aligned. Can you speak about some of that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is another place where I think part of this is about that opportunism that lets this movement kind of skate into a local culture and figure out how to use it. And that's not to say that it's not sincerely felt by people who are in this movement in these places. But so for instance, there is a concerted effort in the movement in the 1970s and 80s to move to the Pacific Northwest. They call this the Northwest Imperative. They're interested in the comparative white homogeneity of the region. They like the climate because they believe white people flourish in colder climates. They want access to the ocean, so they don't like the Midwest very much because of, I don't know, military strategic reasons. And I think they're also just really into it. Like they write these very long, beautiful poetic pieces about, the purity of the land and the beauty of the pine trees and the clarity of the light. And, they're trying to get people to move up there. And their idea is that they're going to go to the Northwest and then populate the land with white babies. We're going to outbreed the enemy, they say. We are going to win the war with our love for each other. So they're going to go there. Many of them are into practicing polygamy. They want to have as many children as possible to seize a white homeland is the idea. But there's also that same thing happening in the South with a whole different set of sort of cultural constructs around it, having to do with the lost cause and with the South didn't really die and we can still win this war. We're going to have the Free State of Carolina. And it's a very similar kind of project, although that one doesn't get quite the same traction. So I think there are local conditions in the Pacific Northwest, and there is an influx of activists, and both of those things make it a hotbed of activity for a number of reasons. It also, I think that somebody, maybe do we have grad students here? Somebody needs to write a book about the overlap between extremist Mormonism in this period and white power, because they're drawing heavily on Southern Idaho and Utah. And I think there's also a sort of broad survivalism in the Pacific Northwest that's not political necessarily, that brings a lot of people to the region who are prepared to accept a degree of this activity. So if you think about a place like Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, where the site of one of these movement strongholds, there are a lot of survivalists in Coeur d'Alene who have nothing to do with white power, but who are simply interested in living off the land and being separate. They don't trust the state. There are leftist survivalists in a lot of these places too. So I think all of that is working for the movement in the Northwest. And then the other thing I would say is that the sort of federal land management issue is one that has been very lucrative is the wrong word, fruitful for galvanizing local communities. So things like Malheur and the stuff in Utah around the Bundys, I think has to do also with general dissatisfaction with the Bureau of Land Management. And I think that all of that works really well in the Northwest and in the West in general.
Thank you. We always want historians to predict. And so, you were saying that we couldn't have predicted January 6th, although there was a lot of organizing happening right out in the open. And folks are noting that they're seeing organizing happening about September 18th in Washington, D.C. So can you tell us maybe a little bit about sort of how you as a historian look at things that are happening in real time that your scholarship informs, and how you feel about predicting the future, and then also maybe predict a little bit for us about what you're seeing?
Sure. And somebody just commented post-Afghanistan. I mean, post-Afghanistan is going to be huge. I think, watching that news coverage of the helicopters taking off from the embassy and knowing how important the story about the fall of Saigon was to so many of these people. And I was on a show recently where somebody was saying that Americans have a short memory and nobody will remember that, but that's just not true I don't think that's true at all, frankly, but that's definitely not true of this movement when we have activists like Dylan Roof, who was the shooter at the AME church in Charleston and a white power activist. He was posing with a Rhodesian flag, which was not even a flag during his lifetime, but these are live wires within this discourse that are still very symbolic. We have people posing with those, I forget who this even was, but at Charlottesville, there were the Pinochet was right shirts about killing communists. All of these are still live issues. The
Proud Boys often. The Proud Boys also often.
We haven't settled any of this. This is all still here. So thinking about what we know about the aftermath of war, that Afghanistan, the fall of Kabul happened the week the census numbers came out. So we know that people in this movement are feeling attacked and betrayed. And we know that in the past that's led to guerrilla war against the state. So I just have no reason to think that it wouldn't again. I think, I don't know, man, I hope I'm wrong about that. I really think that the context is ripe for activity right now, and that's very concerning. That said, I, as a historian, am not in the chat rooms. I'm not monitoring. I read sort of the stories that get sent my way, but I'm actually not out there looking for this right now because I'm trying to write a book about something else. So I'm also trying to sort of like figure out how to connect some of what I've learned about this to these broader currents in our present day society, and also to sort of how we think about violence more broadly and how we might think about the way that all of this is being fueled by intense divisions in our politics and in our communities, deep separation from each other, not just because of COVID, but also because of the way we build our houses, the way we build our neighborhoods, the way we separate ourselves from each other, and how all of that is part of this sort of big contextual picture that delivers us to these problems. So I'm trying to do both of those things, I suppose. I'm probably not doing either of them that well right now.
I have a slight observation there and maybe a follow-up question. So, thinking about the connection you made to Vietnam is clear. And in your work, the connection to white power movements and militarism is very clear coming out of Vietnam. And actually earlier, you've got the Korean War folks, World War II folks,
Yes.
as you were noting, which I think is something worth spelling out to our audience so they can think about, what are the patterns that we've seen in the past that are why you make these observations about what's likely to happen with Afghanistan. And then, of course, the other piece of the puzzle from my perspective, also studying foreign policy and ideas, is that there are always domestic repercussions from foreign wars, whether they're victorious or not, right? There's a nostalgia for conflict in most countries, but certainly here in the US, that then, should a war be coded as not a positive outcome, right? So Vietnam, Afghanistan, you have a nostalgia for the lost promise of these conflicts, right? Which is part of what leads to this alternative reality, frankly, of people who think that the wars could have been won, or that they were waged in, the stab in the back syndrome. You can think about other nation states in this, which is why the past seems like prologue for what may very well happen here, especially this being our longest war. I mean, as you were saying, it strikes me every time. I now teach 9/11 as history. I teach it through documents. Anybody who's older than we are, that may surprise them. But our students have no idea. Teach it through documents and news clips. This is the generation then that will get fed or feast on a nostalgia or a different kind of an alternative history of this conflict by some of the people who came back from this conflict as well, or claim to have, right? Which is another component of the false memories. And so one of the things you and I have talked about also in this context, if you can wrap it all up in some beautiful answer, that'd be great. But if not, that's fine too, is the myth of the spat upon Vietnam War event, for instance, as a way of generating a kind of view of the popular lack of will to fight a conflict, and that got wrapped up in a kind of white masculinity as well, that really helped fuel the movements you're talking about.
There's a good new book exactly about this by Joseph Darda called, I think, How White Men Won the Culture Wars, A History of Veteran America, that looks at this more broadly. I like this book a lot. It's really interesting. And the reason I'm clutching on the title is because I read it in manuscript before it was that title. But part of what he's looking at is all of the different ways that not just extremist movements, but all Americans are invested in the story we tell about war. And that seems so simple to say, but this is a thing historians sort of have to prove over and over again, because there's not just one truth about, what the Vietnam War was. It's being deeply contested and revised and exploited over time in all kinds of different ways. So in the case of the white power movement, what I thought I might find in the archive, based on how these activists were talking about it, was a movement made of veterans who simply wanted to keep fighting. I think that's not actually what it is, although I think the very small number of veterans that did join this movement had enormous impact on escalating violence within these groups, because they brought weapons expertise and explosives and tactics and all kinds of other kind of valuable violent skill sets. But I think it actually is following Joanna Burke's work, that all of us are more violent in the aftermath of warfare. If you look at measures of any kind of social violence, they all spike in the aftermath of warfare, whether or not we're talking about, men of age to have served, or women and children, or elderly people. All of those measures spike, and not just in the United States, but I think she studied Britain and Australia too. So that made me think that this really is about some bigger set of consequences. It's not just that we can wage a war far away and it stays far away. We wage a war and it comes home. Sometimes people bring it home deliberately, like the guys I'm writing about and the women that I'm writing about, but sometimes it's also just this broader cultural acceptance and preponderance towards this activity. So my students at Chicago want to take this directly to Max Weber and talk about the state's monopoly on violence. And is it that we've grabbed it and then we let it go? And I tend to think of it more as like a set of reverberations and ricochet effects, where we receive the ricochet back of the violence we wage elsewhere. And I think that it's an important thing to remember when we're waging these wars that go on and on and on, largely out of view until there's a huge catastrophe like the one in Kabul.
Can I ask one final question, which maybe is related to this, and I'm not sure, but there's a great question in the Q&A about how to explain the involvement of people of color in white power movements. And maybe that has to do with
Yeah.
some of what you were just talking about. Can you explain that for us?
Yeah, this is an interesting one. So this too is not new. There's a guy in a white terrorist group in the 80s called Tom Martinez, who is a working class Latino guy from Philadelphia, who spends a lot of time telling everybody he's Castilian and therefore he's white, right? So there's an iteration of people of color being in these groups by claiming whiteness deliberately. There are also people who are activists of color who have joined these groups because they reflect something about politics that they like. And I think, there's a lot of great new work coming out about people of color who are joining much more mainstream right-wing politics, whether we're talking about Hispanic Republicans who have been invested in those party politics since mid-century, whether we're talking about Black Republicans, whether we're talking about people further to the right than the GOP who are people of color. And there are lots of examples of this all over the place. I think within these groups, there are all kinds of loopholes and workarounds, because at the bottom, I think it's opportunistic. So I think there are ways to be a good or appropriate person of color within this ideology. I think there are ways that the groups are sometimes flexible. And I think there are groups that are involved with one component of the ideology and not the white supremacy. And I think all of those seem to be at play right now. And that's kind of as far as I can get about it. Oh yeah, hey, somebody has a great comment here about Joe Lowndes and Daniel Hosang's book. That's definitely a great place to look for some of the more recent work on this. And I would also point you to Cynthia Miller Idris's sociological work on, what is it called? Hate in the Homeland, something like that. There's a lot of great work on the new movement that's more like this. I think that this is a bigger factor now than it was in the period that I studied.
Well, we always try to end on time or close to time. We reserve the right to do about 15 minutes extra Q&A, and it's been great talking with you. But I would love to, I know Eliza's going to close us down, but I can't help but ask one more question, which is sort of how the series started, which is about professional historians engaging in the public and what are some of our shared obligations. We're doing this through the Oregon Historical Society, which has a state and nationwide mission to bring the best of public history, of professional history to the wider public. So I wonder, from my perspective, I'm deeply committed to this public work. It's clear you are. There's sort of an urgent question that I think guides a lot of the people who come to our conversations, which is, how should we be confronting our shared past? Most of what you and I have talked about is pretty tough stuff. And it resulted in part, one of the things it resulted in is an insurrection in the US Capitol, right? Yeah. One of the more catastrophic, at least high profile kinds of events that you could imagine in American public life, really putting in jeopardy, fracturing democracy in some fundamental way that none of us were really sure would happen. So, it's a kind of tough question, granted, but how do you think we should be confronting our shared past?
I think with hope and fortitude, I suppose. I look out and I see a whole bunch of people who don't want a simplified version of our history. I see high school students in Colorado who are not in the AP classes walking out demanding for us to teach real history to our high school students. People want to learn civics. I think even something like Make America Great Again is a claim about our nation's history, and we have to meet it there as historians. And I think that we do a lot of backing away when we should be talking about what happened and what our shared past was. And I'll also say that, part of what drew me to this work in the very early stages was the realization that looking at race and reconciliation sort of worldwide, we are not alone at all in our histories of violence and racism and white supremacy. There are a lot of countries that have faced these issues, but we are somewhat alone in how little we've done to come to terms with that as a national polity. We've had very little by the way of making museums together, having truth commissions, having reconciliation projects, having memorials about these issues. And you can see that because things like removing a Confederate statue today in Virginia is still huge top of the fold news. And we don't put up a new statue. We don't have the conversations about what that history is and what it means. I think we should have those conversations. And The other thing on Twitter today was that there aren't listings for US history jobs. I think we have to think way more broadly about where the work of history sits, because I know I can't single-handedly fix this job market, but my students can go do this work in a whole lot of different venues, and we need them out there doing it. So history and civics for everybody, I guess, is my answer.
It's the perfect answer. Thank you all so very much for doing this evening. This was just informative and energizing, and we're seeing a lot of thank you to you all in the chat. I want to make sure folks know we've recorded this program, and so we'll send out a link so that everyone who signed up can have access to it again. Kathleen, we will be anxiously awaiting both Field Guide to White Supremacy and the next book that you are working on about violence more broadly. So let us know when it's out, and we hope that we can host you again. Chris, thank you very much. And thanks everyone for joining us. We really appreciate you, and we will see you at the next virtual or in-person program. So take care, everybody.
Thank you very
all
much.
so much. Yes, have a great night.